I'm delighted to welcome you to the 21st edition of the World Sustainable Development Summit. I'm the MC for this session, and my name is Shanmuganathan. This session is titled Global Commons Beyond Sovereign Domains, Oceans, Atmosphere, and Biodiversity. The session will be moderated by Dr. Shelley Kedia, Senior Fellow, TERI. We are happy to have a very distinguished line of speakers who need no introduction. For Science Leadership Address, we have Professor Jan Jalasius, Chair, Anthropocene Working Group, International Commission on Stratigraphic, and Professor Mark Williams, Professor, University of Leicester, and Professor Will Stephen, Emeritus Professor, Australian National University. For Leadership Address, we have our esteemed speakers, Dr. Bruno Obrili, Director General, International Union for Conservation of Nature, Mr. Emmanuel Lenin, Ambassador, Embassy of France, Mr. Hans Jacob Fridolin, Ambassador, the Royal Norwegian Embassy, Mr. Raphael Guller, Head of Unit for Ocean Governance, Law of the Sea and Arctic Policy, European Commission. During the session, we shall also have the launch of Vasundhara 9th edition, a student magazine of TERI School of Advanced Studies. I now invite Dr. Shelley Kedia to conduct the proceedings of the session. Over to you, Shelley.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome to all our distinguished panelists and speakers. Global economic growth has indeed led to the overuse of resources, leading to the hardened tragedy of the commons. Since global commons are outside national jurisdictions, policies related to their conservation and sustainable use can potentially conflict with national sovereignty and regulation. Developed and developing nations need to work together to protect and govern our global commons. We are now in the second day of the summit, and we have listened to a host of world political leaders, including our Honorable Prime Minister, who inaugurated the summit yesterday. So we now come to an extremely interesting segment of our summit, and to that end, we will have a host of science leadership address, and we would like to start the discussions that on the basis of science. So to begin with, and not to waste any more time, I would like to invite Professor Jean and Professor Mark Williams to deliver their science leadership address.
Very pleased to be here with Mark and with Will also. We're all members of the Anthropocene working group, working on establishing the reality of this new epoch that we live in. Next slide, please, Mark. We have, yes, this concept was started by Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen 20 years ago now, when at a meeting in Mexico, he said, we're no longer living in the Holocene, the stable epoch in which civilization developed. Things have changed too much, he said. And on the spot, he improvised this new term and concept, the Anthropocene, which we've been working on ever since. Next slide, please. This is our logo. It's very particularly designed. Next slide, please. It's basically a horizontal line and a vertical line. And that marks 15,000 years worth of change in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And for almost all of that time, the rate of change stayed very steady, very slow. Only in the last century or so, mainly the last 70 years, has this taken a very, very steep upturn to load the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. It may be the steepest rise in all of geological history. Next slide, please. it's not just carbon dioxide. There are a whole host of other changes. So the global environment is being loaded with plastics, with concrete, pesticides, fertilizers, radionuclides, heavy metals, and so on. All of these are marking the environment of today, and these will, of course, make the strata of the future. Next slide, please. Much of this, pretty well all of this, is driven by energy. The amount of energy used in the last 70 years has exceeded the amount of energy used in the previous 11,000 years by humans. It's been an extraordinary rise in energy use, mainly of hydrocarbon fuels, of fossil fuels. Next slide, please. That has led to 1 trillion tons of extra carbon dioxide in the air. And that would make a layer about a meter thick as a pure gas. And that is currently thickening by about 1 millimeter every 2 weeks. Next slide, please. That is causing a huge heat imbalance on the Earth. And the equivalent of that is the pouring into the oceans every second of about 4 billion cups of hot tea. That's much more energy than we're actually physically extracting from the fuels for use. Next slide, please. And of course, that is having consequences. Ice is melting, sea level is rising, and that is threatening low-lying parts of the world globally. That is just one symptom of the Anthropocene, of this new epoch started by Paul Crutzen. Mark will now take over onto the huge question of how that is affecting life on Earth.
Well, I wanted to start by saying that the human population that is driving these changes now numbers 7.9 billion. Some of us consume more, some of us consume much less, but the overriding pattern of human consumption is severely stressing the biosphere, shifting it into a new state. And now more than half of the people that live on this planet live in towns and cities, some of which have become truly vast. 7.9 billion people is very difficult, I think, for us to imagine, but maybe we can get a feel for those numbers if we think about the abundance of some of our close primate relatives. Our two closest relatives, for example, the chimpanzee numbers about 250,000 in the wild, and the bonobo numbers about 20,000. So those two species really are equivalent to no more than one small human city or one small human town. Indeed, we as a single species are more than 99% of all primate abundance on Earth, which is a remarkable figure for any large species. And we overconsume. We and our domesticated mammals account for 95% of the terrestrial mammal biomass, and we appropriate as much as 1/3 of the energy from all plants. And for Jan and I, as geologists looking at life on Earth, no species ever dominated land and sea like humans in 4 billion years of Earth history. We have profoundly altered the Earth's surface. We use half of the habitable land for farming, and our footprint can be found in pretty much every space on this planet. And into these profoundly changed landscapes and their ecologies, we've delivered modified species. One of these is the broiler chicken, whose individual mass we've increased 4-fold in the past 60 years, simply because we like eating them. We consume them in vast numbers. Over 20 billion of them are alive at any one time, and about 63 billion chickens are eaten every year. Now, if you compare that to the next most populous bird on the planet, the red-billed curlew, it's an order of magnitude greater than anything in nature. We've introduced non-native species from far away across the world, many thousands of them. Some of these are benign, some are actually beneficial to their new ecologies, but many are very damaging. And the latter, the damaging forms, proliferate in human-changed ecologies, just as the manila clam here is proliferating in San Francisco Bay. Now, these changes to the biosphere are truly profound by any measure that Jan and I look at in geological time, and they've already left a significant fossil record which geologists can clearly recognize. But the changes yet may be more profound if humans join the ignominious ranks of asteroid strikes and sustained and massive volcanic eruptions as causal mechanisms of extinction. And that is a distinct possibility in the coming decades. We want to finish with some hope though, because Jan and I still think we can avoid this by learning from nature and studying how the beneficial interrelationships between organisms in natural ecologies can sustain the whole. If human ecologies can be modeled thus, even to the scale of whole cities, then perhaps there is a good way through the Anthropocene. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jan and Professor Mark Williams. I mean, there is no better experts, on the topic of Anthropocene than the two experts we listen to right now who, apart from being academics at the University of Leicester, also belong to the Anthropocene working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. So thank you so much for that wonderful exposition and for making it clear that we are indeed in an Anthropocene and how humans have really altered the reality of our existence and of planet Earth, but also giving us some hope that we need to learn from nature. I would now like to invite Professor Will Steffen, who's an emeritus professor from the Australian National University, who will be talking about planetary boundaries. And all of us here from the research community, we do know about both these concepts. And so thank you so much for all your presence. And I would like to now invite Professor Steffen. Professor Steffen, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And particular thanks to Jan and Marx for so beautifully introducing the topic of the Anthropocene, which makes it much easier for me to follow on. So if we could put my slides up, I'll have to rely on you guys to put them up and flip them for me. We can start moving into it. Okay. Right, so I'm going to be talking about this concept of planetary boundaries, which is a stage beyond what Mark and Jan were talking about. The question is, how do we deal with this? What do we do with it? And how do we manage ourselves rather than managing the global commons, as I've put here? And that's what planetary boundaries are all about. So next slide, please. I'll talk about four things. First of all, briefly, what is the Earth system? It's not as well known, even in the academic community, as most people think. Briefly, just elaborate a bit on what the Anthropocene is, and I don't need to speak much about that because Jan and Mark have already done that. Then I'll talk more about planetary boundaries and then the global commons. So next slide, please. Well, the best view of the Earth system I can see is actually one from space. This is actually from the moon. And when you look at this little orb floating out there in the blackness of space, you can sort of intuitively see that is a single entity, and everything on it is interlinked into a single system that we call the Earth system. This is pretty alien to science because most of science is organized around disciplines, which is the exact opposite of what we need to do now, which is to understand how the system as a whole actually works. Next slide, please. So a lot of us now look at this as a single system, the atmosphere, the ocean, the land, and so on, all interacting. And to understand the Anthropocene, you need to understand the fact that the planet is a single system with its own properties, its emergent properties at a planetary scale that we can measure, we can monitor, and we can examine profound changes which are occurring not just to land, not just to the biosphere, not just to the geosphere, but to the planet as a whole. Next slide, please. So one of the most important things we need to understand is that all these parts of the Earth system are interlinked. We know a fair bit about atmospheric circulation because we deal with weather every day, and that is due to atmospheric circulation. Those of us down here where I live in Eastern Australia, we are really dependent on what happens across the Pacific Ocean, El Niños, La Niñas, and what happens in the Indian Ocean. But also on longer time frames, we are dependent on the big ocean currents drawn here, which move an enormous amount of energy, enormous amount of water, enormous amount of heat around the planet, and really affect the way the entire planet operates. Next slide, please. So these patterns are typical patterns of what we call a complex system. Complex systems have scales of interaction. You can see in this intuitively how scales work. There are planetary scales like the circulation systems I showed just on the previous slide. But when you go down in scale, you can see around the coast of Japan, there are quite interesting circulation patterns in the ocean, which affect what happens to the Japanese climate, what happens to the Japanese environment, and so on. But even below that, you can see even smaller scale eddies, which are these circular systems in the ocean. So we need to understand patterns of a system. We need to understand interactions between different scales in the ocean, on land, interacting all the way up to the planet as a whole. But again, the point is that when you add this all up, integrate it, you get one system that operates on the planet as a whole. That is the basis indeed for the Anthropocene. It's not about changes in the ocean or the land on their own. It's about a change in the state of the Earth system as a whole. Next slide, please. So one of the ways we can do this is to go back into time and see how the Earth system has changed in the past. This diagram here shows data from an Antarctic ice core. The red line in the middle is a particularly important one because it shows how Earth's temperature has varied over 400,000 years. That encompasses the time that fully modern humans have been on the planet. So this is our home. This is the time scale in Earth's system, a tiny fraction of the time in Earth's system that Homo sapiens has been on the planet. But notice a couple of things. Notice the rhythmic pattern of very warm, short periods, then long descents into ice ages and back out again. It looks rather like a human heartbeat, and indeed it is the heartbeat of the planet. But notice how strongly this is linked, this temperature between two constituents of the atmosphere. The blue on the top is carbon dioxide that we talk a bit these days, and the bottom is one which I think is equally important, which is now gaining in prominence, and that's methane. These things are all interlinked. They are patterns of the dynamics of the system as a whole. And this has an extremely important role to play in the background for what the Anthropocene actually looks like. By the way, the last little bit on the end here, the last about 12,000 years, is the Holocene, which is the preceding epoch in Earth's history. The time before this is all part of the Pleistocene. Okay, let's move forward, please. So if we look at this then in terms of human history, as I mentioned, you can plot human history in its entirety on this one graph of global average temperature. So the best we understand now is fully modern humans evolved sometime around 200 to 300,000 years ago in Africa. So we've actually experienced about two of these cycles, Milankovitch cycles they're called, between ice ages and very warm periods. But interestingly, that until this last about 12,000 years, we have been hunter-gatherer societies only, be it in Africa, Asia, or Australia, or Europe. It's only been in the last 12,000 years that we're beginning to develop agriculture, villages, and then more recently, the enormous megacities that we inhabit today. And I think Mark made a very good point about how much we now absolutely dominate this biosphere. We've come from being a part of the biosphere, a small part in terms of pre-agricultural humans, all the way through to making over at least half of the entire biosphere, now to dominating the geosphere as well. So the next slide, please. So our reference point really here is this last 12,000 years. Now I'm sitting here talking to you from Australia. Humans came to Australia about here during this dip when sea level was very low and Australians could move between Southeast Asia and Australia. So our indigenous people have endured a very rough climate in this driest continent on the planet, and also endured with their culture intact through this transition over about 7,000 or 8,000 years into the Anthropocene. But this period again, next slide, please, and next. Yeah, so this stability of right around what we now use as a marker of 0 degrees Celsius, this stability of the Holocene has been the sweet spot for humanity. It's allowed us to expand around the world, develop agriculture, villages, and so on. They were unheard of before about 11 thousand years ago. Next slide, please. So this is our reference point. And again, I'm just marking on here what I've just told you about how humans have expanded around the planet. Next slide, please. What I want to focus on now is the Holocene, because this is the baseline against which we are measuring the Anthropocene as we vastly changed the Earth system in only a few decades. Next slide, please. So this is the last 2,000 years of the Holocene. Again, this is very important for us because most of the contemporary civilizations that we live in, whether we live in China or other parts of East Asia, whether we live in the Middle East, whether we live in Europe, whether we live in Australia, whether we live in the Americas, all of us have experienced an exceptionally steady and stable state of the Earth system. Temperature around the planet has varied only about 1/10 or maybe 2/10 of a degree. This has allowed us to flourish, to expand in numbers, to develop our economies, to develop the technologies that now totally dominate the biosphere, as Mark has pointed out. Next slide, please. But now I want to talk about the Anthropocene. What, from an Earth system science perspective, is actually happening to the stability domain of the Holocene, and particularly the last few thousand years, which have been exceptionally stable. Geologists now have called that the Megalaean, which is the last approximately 4,000 years of Earth history, and it's been exceptionally stable and accommodating for the Earth system. But in less than a century, we have completely changed the dynamics, the state, and the future of the Earth system. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we did in an international program that I previously worked at was try to track what actually has happened in the last few centuries to the Earth system. So the first thing we did was to look at what has happened to us humans. So these 12 graphs actually show aspects of humans: population, economy, energy, resource use, and so on. It's hard to see the time scale, but it goes back to 1750. And that was really a trigger by Paul Crutzen, who said, I think things really started to change with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in England in the late 1700s and then spread around the planet. When I drew this, I was at the International Geosphere Biosphere program, and I was leading a program that was looking at the data over this last time frame. Our first set of data only went from the year 1900 to 2000. But after Paul's intervention, we said, we need to go back in time. I expected to see a reasonably linear curve from 1750 to 2000. I didn't. I was a bit surprised when I saw when the data came in. And in fact, it showed, yes, things were happening with the Industrial Revolution, but pretty slowly. But when I looked at this, I said, well, I use an expletive, which I won't repeat. but I looked at the mid 20th century and I said, something really happened there to the human enterprise. Things really changed. We used a lot more resources. Our population exploded. Our economy exploded even more. So then the question was, can we see any trace of this in the Earth system? Next slide, please. So we did the same thing with the Earth system. So the top 6 are the geosphere. The bottom 6 graphs, little graphs, are the biosphere. So we looked at the atmosphere. We looked at ocean acidification. We looked at the stratosphere and so on. What we saw was pretty interesting because, again, from 1750, things started changing, but in many cases, not very much. Again, around the middle of the 20th century, in most of these graphs, things took off. And then we dug into the literature behind both of these sets of 12 graphs, and 2 things stood out. One is that these 12 graphs of the Earth system, geosphere and biosphere, as far as we could see, were unprecedented. This was something we had not seen before when we looked at the paleo record. So we said, this is outside of natural variability, for sure. And we could demonstrate that extremely clearly. But the second thing we said is, we know what the driver is. It's humans. It is direct human pressure on this. The combination of population, but actually more important than population, was economy and technology was driving this. The term great acceleration came a few years later from historian John McNeill, who in a workshop looked at these graphs himself and used the term great acceleration. But it was pretty clear that we humans had shifted the Earth system out of the Holocene stability domain. Next slide, please. You can see this in a more profound way by some graphs that Jaya Savitsky has produced more recently, which again looks at the whole Holocene. So this left-hand side is looking at us humans, it's our population, it's our cumulative energy use, and it's our GDP. Again, look at the spikes at the end of the Holocene. They're enormous, they're unprecedented. And I think as Mark or Jan have pointed out, it's really hard to find changes this fast in the 4.5 billion year history of Earth. When you look at, again, from about the 1700s onward, again, you see some creeping up of population, of energy use and GDP, but nothing like what happens post-1950. An absolute explosion of human population, activity, energy use, and impact on the Earth system. Next slide, please. We did a visualization. This is a bit of a fun thing I did with National Geographic in 2011. They wanted to show the great acceleration visually, and they used an identity that John Holdren and Paul Ehrlich introduced in the 1970s, the so-called IPAT equation, that the impact of humans is some combination of population times affluence times technology. So this obviously lends itself to a three-dimensional object. So we did this. So National Geographic produced this, and I think if I get this right, there is population, there is technology, which was measured by patents, and here is affluence, which is measured by GDP. This box is filled with stuff that we make. It's got cars, it's got airplanes, it's got houses, it's got all sorts of stuff that humans make. Now, there's an interesting backstory here because National Geographic had only two notches here. It had 1900, which is this little tiny wedge here, and it had 2011. And I wrote back and said, this is completely missing the story. And they were a bit shocked. And I said, what do you mean missing the story? And I said, put in 1950, not just 1900 and 2011, put in 1950. And they argued with me. They said, that's just going to be halfway up. I said, no, it's not. Put in 1950. And here it is, 1950. So here is 1900, here's 1950, here's a bit over 2000. They were stunned. And I said, this is exactly what you want to show. This is the great acceleration. So I think this is one of the most beautiful visual representations of what we're actually talking about here. This is something astounding in the history of the planet. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we can look at the scientific representations. You've all seen this. This is global average surface temperature. Again, here's 1950, a bit of a lag from about 1970. It's going up quite strongly. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, so 2020, we're about 1.2 degrees above the long-term average, which is a pretty significant change, much higher than anything we've seen in the Holocene, probably already passing Eemian conditions in two, which was the last interglacial period. Next one, please. But if you look at that in a longer term perspective, this is again that 2,000-year record, the late Holocene baseline. This spike here in that long-term time frame is what's happened in just a few decades. I think as Mark and Jan have both pointed out, this is extraordinary. It's unprecedented in probably the 4.5 billion year history of Earth, perhaps with the only exception of the 66 million year ago spike when the meteorite struck. But of course, it drove temperature in the opposite direction. It cooled the planet. So I think we're pretty safe to say that the Earth has never experienced a warming trend this fast in its 4.5 billion year history. Next slide, please. And that just emphasizes that this spike is definitely human influence. This is without a doubt not natural variability. Next slide, please. So we can look at the rates. The rate of atmospheric CO2 increase over the past 2 decades, it's about 100 times faster compared to the maximum rate during the last deglaciation, which was pretty fast. Last half century, global average temperature has risen at a rate 200 times the background rate over the past 7,000 years of the Holocene, and in the opposite direction. This is why ice is melting fast. This is why Eastern Australia is burning. This is why massive flooding is hitting Europe, and so on. These current rates of CO2 and temperature change are almost unprecedented in the entire 4.5 billion year geological past. And that's from a synthesis project done by the Geological Society of London. Next slide, please. So let's look at human transformation of biosphere in the Anthropocene. Mark can talk about this much more authoritatively than I can. I'll show you a couple of slides quickly here. Next slide, please. The International Science Policy Platform in 2019 published a synthesis of what's happening. Next, please. Nature is declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history. Next one, please. About 1 million of 7 or 8 million animal and plant species that we know of are now threatened with extinction, many within decades. Sixth great extinction event is already underway. The web of life on Earth is getting smaller and increasingly frayed. So in fact, one could argue, Mark's already shown this, one could argue that we are affecting the biosphere at least as much or perhaps more than we are the geosphere at present. Next slide, please. And this is a paper, I think, which is really important. There's Mark again, and he was the lead author on this. There are some extraordinary conclusions from this paper. Next, please. Global homogenation of flora and fauna. We're mixing flora and fauna on every continent around the planet, and we're starting to do it in the ocean. We commandeer up to 40% of the productivity of the entire biosphere every year, and we are mining fossil productivity of the biosphere, i.e. fossil fuels. We are now directing the evolution of other species. Look at that chicken that we saw a couple of slides ago. And we're increasingly interacting the biosphere with all the technical stuff that we are throwing in, things that we often call novel entities, radioactive materials, plastics, chemicals. They are ubiquitous around every corner of planet Earth. And I think Mark made the comment, next slide, please, that this could be a new third stage of biosphere evolution. This is really an extraordinary comment. He can comment on it more, but basically I think what he's saying is that the first stage was the evolution of life. The second stage was the evolution of complex life from single-celled organisms. What we are doing now to the biosphere may be equivalent in its impact, in its importance for the future of the biosphere on Earth than those first two stages. Next slide, please. So we put this together, a group of us, in what the Earth system actually looks like in 2020. We wouldn't have drawn this 20 years ago, but what we show is the geosphere, which everyone knows about. Geologists have known about it for a long time, the biosphere, but now a huge sphere over here is the anthroposphere, the human sphere, which is interacting in multiple complex ways with the rest of the Earth system. It's a very different Earth system than it was a few decades ago, and certainly a very different Earth system from the Holocene. Next slide, please. All right, let's go on to planetary boundaries. That was a rather long-winded introduction, but you need to understand why we are talking about planetary boundaries in the Earth system science community. We are well outside of the Holocene. What will it take to get back in there? How can we define a Holocene-like state of the Earth system if we could possibly get back, which we may not be able to? All right, next slide, please. So the concept was introduced by Johan Rockström from Sweden in 2007 at a meeting of the Tällberg Forum up in northern Sweden. And it was quite a profound, I think, introduction by Johan saying, look, you scientists, you fellow scientists, we've been talking about the problems. What really is what do we need to do? Where do we need to get to? How do we find what is actually the stable, safe state of the Earth system? And can we get back to it? So that's the origin of the planetary boundaries. Next slide, please. So there are scientifically based levels of how much we can perturb this system, the entire Earth system, beyond which Earth system functioning may be significantly altered. Now you'll see, and I'll preface this, we're already beyond the planetary boundaries. That's what the Anthropocene is telling us. But how far and how badly are we out, and can we get back? The framework does not dictate how society should develop, but it certainly tells you how the Earth system is changing and what we need to do to stabilize it. So we call this a safe operating space. We hope it makes a valuable contribution to decision makers in how we go forward. Next slide, please. And we've published a lot, starting in the original paper in 2009, an update in 2015. We are now on the third update, which is underway. It should be published later this year. And I have to tell you, it's sobering, it's upsetting, and it's probably saying you're not going to get back to anything near what the Holocene was like. We've gone too far. It's not a good thing for scientists to say, but we have to be honest. That's what it looks like. Next slide, please. So this is what it looked like in 2015. It's a radar diagram. We have 9 planetary boundaries that represent the geosphere and the biosphere. And we had this, the radar diagram, we called it, where the green zone in the middle, this is the Holocene-like state. It isn't quite the Holocene, but it's perturbations that we can probably live in. Then we have a zone of uncertainty. We think, well, the science isn't very clear, but we know we're in trouble. The red zone is we know we are in deep trouble. So the ones we know we are in deep trouble are biosphere integrity. Mark can say this a lot better than I can about how vastly we are changing the biosphere. The other ones are the important element cycles of nitrogen and phosphorus. But land system change, climate change are moving fast away from the stability zone. I can tell you here that on this diagram, 4 of the 9 boundaries are transgressed. I can tell you on the paper that's coming out, a minimum of 6 and possibly 8 of the 9 boundaries will be transgressed. All of the boundaries, except for stratospheric ozone, which we have under control, all other of the other 8 boundaries are moving in the wrong direction, and they are accelerating. Not a good story. Next slide, please. So I won't go through this. We've documented in great detail what the current status of these so-called control variables are. It's not a good look. We'll update them and publish them next year. Next slide, please. So in this update, as I mentioned, the 2 core planetary boundaries. So climate change really is the core boundary representing the geosphere. What we call biosphere integrity, the integrity of the biosphere, which is a complex concept, represents the biosphere. Both of them have been transgressed, and they are accelerating away from a stability domain. We're now identifying a 3rd core boundary, which we call novel entities, new stuff, plastics, radionuclides, electromagnetic radiation, with Wi-Fi, all this. We're throwing all of this stuff into the Earth system. By the way, many of these could be markers for the Anthropocene, which I think Jan could talk more about. But we're now saying this is now, novel entities are a core boundary. And those core boundaries represent the 3 spheres of the Earth system: the geosphere, climate change, the biosphere integrity, and the anthroposphere, novel entities. Next slide, please. And we're looking at interactions too. And if you look at this little cartoon, it shows you climate change, biodiversity, cultures, health, water, they are all interlinked. So one of the things we're trying to do in the third...
Professor Stephen, could I request you to please hurry up? We have just 20 minutes left into this session.
Well, I'm in my 3rd of 4 sessions, so I think I'll get there. Okay, thanks for the reminder. Okay, next one, please. So the update I've already talked about, 3 core boundaries, at least 6, possibly 8 will be transgressed. And I think the critical thing, for most boundaries, we're moving deeper into the red zone, the rate of transgression. Summary, the Earth system is being destabilized at an increasing rate. There is absolutely no doubt that is what the evidence is showing. We are moving in the wrong direction at an increasing rate. Next, please. So this is the conclusion, part 4. The global commons, us humans. What do we do about this? Well, we're trying to do something. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, and you can see there are 17 of them, and when you unpack them, there are 100 and some odd indicators and so on, hugely complex, and it represents obviously a big opportunity, but also a huge puzzle. How do you actually achieve something that complex in the short time frame that we have? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, can the planetary boundaries help? I hope so. As I said, they give an indication of how far away we are. They have been picked up by the OECD, Global Energy, UNEP, and so on, World Economic Forum 2013, 2015. But I have to tell you, when I look at the outcomes of all of those over the last decade, there has been no appreciable evidence that anything we are saying with the planetary boundaries have actually been taken up. And there's no evidence that it's shown any difference to any of the trajectories of these groups, of the global economy, of the energy system, or anything. We have a serious problem in front of us. Next slide, please. So basically what we need to do, and this diagram shows how quickly we need to do it, is to move off this trajectory, which shows present about 2020, is accelerating away from the planetary boundaries. We need to get within the planetary boundaries by 2040 or 2050. Look at how steep that curve is. Is it even possible? We don't know. All we can say is the science is saying, this is what you've got to do if you want to stabilize the Earth system in any sort of state that is close to being commensurate with human well-being. It's an existential threat, and that's all we can say about it. Next one, please. Next one, please. All right, I'm going to close with a few slides from areas that I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with the social sciences, but I do a lot of work with colleagues in there, so I take their advice on this. One of the most interesting ones is Kate Rayworth from Oxford, who has developed a donut economics approach. So if you look at her donut, the inside is what we all care about: health, food, water, and so on, but also equality, gender, social equality, jobs, resilience, education. This is what a good human society looks like. But we don't have an infinite planet to work on. We have a ceiling, and those are the 9 planetary boundaries. If we want a stable planet to inhabit and work with to develop our social system, we have to have a stable natural system on the planet, and we don't. That's what the planetary boundaries are about. And if I drew the wedges, we're way outside of that. But she says this is what we have to aim for, a safe and just space for humanity. Next one, please. So what did she say? Well, she had 7 major points. I picked out 3 of them. One is systems thinking. We've got very linear thinking. The whole neoliberal economic system is based on linear, very simplistic kindergarten thinking. We need to think of dynamic complexity. We need to think of equity. We need to think of an economic system that is distributive by design. And the most important one, in my view, is the biosphere. It has to regenerate by design. If I had anything to do with this, I would ban the word resource from the English language. The rest of the living part of this planet is not a resource. We're part of it. We have to be stewards of it. It's our life support system, and we have to regenerate it. And our economy has to do this. Next slide, please. A really interesting idea comes from Portugal, from my colleague Paulo Magueles, a legal guy. He says, you humans have missed the most important thing you can do from a legal point of view. You do not recognize the Earth system. You divide up the physical Earth into nation states, ocean zones, and maybe even bits of Antarctica, but you do not recognize your common home, which is the Earth system, the intangible system that operates around this planet. So his whole goal is to have legal recognition for the system, not the bits of physical territory that we all occupy, but the Earth system. Next slide, please.
Apologies, Professor Stefan. Can we go? Because then we'll be not on screen,
Okay, next slide, please. All right. So my colleague Catherine Richards says really clearly, we shouldn't be trying to manage the Earth system. We should focus on managing ourselves, our relationship to the Earth system, and our activities. Next one, please. This is my last one. This comes from my continent and my indigenous people. This Noongar people from Western Australia, they have it right. I'll read this to finish off. We're only here for a short amount of time to do what we've been put to do, which is to look after country. We're only a tool in the cycle of things. We go out into the world and help keep the balance of nature. It's a big cycle of living with the land and then eventually going back to it. Indigenous Australians understood cycles, systems, the Earth system, and so on. We've lost that, and we need to get it back. All right, let me end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Stefan, and I hope that the other speakers would forgive us for going a bit over time. I think we'll just to sum up, of course, Professor Stefan highlighted the great acceleration and the anthropogenic influence on the Earth system and the needs for a systems thinking. And we would now go to the next speaker, and I have on my minute to minute Dr. Bruno Oberle, Director General, International Union for Conservation of Nature. I'd just like to request the speakers to please limit their interventions to 5 minutes if possible, please. Thank you.
Charlie, and well noted. Try to stay below 5 minutes. It's very difficult after having this picture globally over at the geological scale, all the size of the challenges we have in face of us, to then find an answer, or even starting looking for an answer. Do we have these donuts? It exists at all. There is a strip between our request to the system and the boundaries that the system is posing to us. Do we have a landing zone at all, or it is impossible to solve this question? And this is on one side a scientific question that was very good highlighted and described by the previous speaker. Thank you very much for that. And on the other side, it's a political question. How can we try to get there? I will concentrate on one specific topic, marine, and in particular the protected areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is probably the biggest common that we have on this planet. And let me start telling that as it was demonstrated this time now, to be bold and visionary, but also pragmatic for the benefit of humankind and oceankind. We need to adopt ambitious goals and objectives to secure ocean health, productivity, and resilience. We need to manage the global ocean as a shared common, based on principle of equity, informed decision-making, shared responsibility, and accountability. Pragmatically, we need to adopt systematic, strategic, and collaborative processes to identify common interests. It will be key to avoid competition while building nimble institutions that can manage the challenges of a rapidly changing ocean. Considering the urgency of rebuilding and maintaining ocean health, all stakeholders will have to cooperate to conclude an ambitious Pbnj agreement in 2022. Today, many sectoral and regional bodies have a mandate to establish specific rules, but these have limited membership and do not apply to states that are not party to the relevant agreement. The upcoming International Conference on Marine Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction in March is a critical opportunity to consolidate progress made since the last meeting. But negotiators have to strike a delicate balance, reaching an ambitious agreement that empowers the conference of parties and protects marine biodiversity, while also accommodating and respecting the rights and interests of all states. Another point that I would like to make is that the global ocean is a common, whose health is a shared interest of all humanity. Hence, we need equity in our approach to the ocean so that we can unlock benefit for all humankind in the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction. The management of the ocean should also be climate smart and take into account connectivity. In addition to marine protected areas, the Pbnj agreement could enable the evolution of innovative area-based management tools like dynamic closures and migratory corridors, or even mobile marine protected areas. The Pbnj agreement should be seen as a key platform to convene the relevant stakeholders in an integrated, transparent manner and a channel for raising collective ambitions. It will need to go beyond the existing mandates of the various competent organizations in delivering the transformative change we need to conserve the ocean. For almost 20 years, IUCN has been one of the key players, bringing the issue of rising risk and threats to marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction to international attention, promoting the need for using existing instruments better. At the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille last year, our members adopted a resolution called Acting for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Biodiversity in the Ocean Beyond National Jurisdiction. The resolution recognized that the ocean in areas beyond national jurisdiction is a common concern of humankind, and it should be protected as one ocean. Let us rally around this message, not just at this conference today, but far into the future. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, it is time to be bold and visionary, but also pragmatic for the benefit of humankind and oceankind. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Director General Bruno Oberle, for highlighting the need for participatory approaches, including in area-based management of marine resources. I understand I've got a note that Ambassador Fridolin has to go and catch a flight, so I would request Ambassador Fridolin, who is the ambassador of the Royal Norwegian Embassy in New Delhi, to go next, please.
Thank you. And I will also try then to cut in even more than 5 minutes to allow open space also for my fellow panelists. Fellow panelists, delegates, friends of TERI, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to once again address the WSDS. It was a very stark message that we just got from Professor Steffen. And that goes straight into the issue of the global commons, and he actually puts the planet as a global common. And then it's our problem as diplomats and as practitioners. How are we going to move forward to actually counter these processes? And for Norway, as a small country, it's affected and dependent of action of larger states. We have always worked intensively to enhance the global governance of the resources we own together. We believe rules-based binding international corporations through the multilateral system is the best way to preserve our global commons. Contributing to strengthening and adapting global governance, especially through United Nations, is a key priority of our foreign policy. And in this intervention, I will just focus now on one issue, and that was picked up by Ms. Oberle, the oceans. Because the oceans is of vital importance to our society and culture. And the ocean industries are the backbone of our economy, accounting for nearly 70% of our export earnings. And it has huge potential. According to the OECD, ocean-based industries could double the contribution to the global economy by 2030. But the oceans are under pressure today as a result of climate change, overfishing, and pollution. Plastics makes up to 80% of all marine litter. And this is why Norway has been working for several years for a global agreement on plastic pollution. Improved waste management and recycling is important, but to save our oceans and our climate, we need to produce less plastic and regulate what types of plastic material we use. Later this month, at the UNEA 5.2, we're co-sponsoring a resolution calling for setting up an intergovernmental negotiating committee to negotiate a legally binding agreement. If adopted, this will be a landmark achievement by UNEA and a unique opportunity to restore faith in our multilateral system's ability to protect the commons. We also engage in voluntary actions to push for better management of the global commons. To promote sustainable ocean economy, Norway took part in setting up the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy in 2018. The 16 member states of the Ocean Panel, accounting for at least 45% of the world coastlines, have taken bold steps to apply the latest ocean knowledge and has presented a transformative set of priority actions to catalyze and scale ocean solutions that benefit people, nature, and the economy. Dear colleagues, to improve our management of the global commons, we need joint research and data to gain common understanding of problems and find solutions together. We need global goals and national actions to ensure we work towards the same objectives and measure our progress. We need trust and mutual respect so that we understand each other's specific circumstances and find effective ways of moving in the same direction. We need international cooperation that transfers technology, provides financing, and builds capacity in all countries. Norway is ready to do its part. That is why the Norwegian government has set a target to double its overall climate financing by 2026, at the latest, among other initiatives. Dear colleagues, the engagement and participation at this year's WSDS is a good sign that we're taking our global commons more seriously. Norway is a proud partner of TERI and WSDS. Thank you, TERI, for organizing this event. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And yes, I might just add that Norway is a small country, but a very strong voice in terms of normative leadership, especially when it comes to the oceans. And thank you so much, Your Excellency. I now have the privilege to invite Ambassador Emmanuel La Nina, who is the ambassador of the Embassy of France. And again, like, you know, I'd just like to mention that this panel is also co-hosted with the EU, who is our senior partner for the summit. And so please do apologize, you know, while we do have EU in the last, but as co-hosts, you know, do please make that exception. Over to you, Ambassador La Nina. Your Excellency, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy. I'm delighted to participate. It's great pleasure. It's great pleasure to come back to an event organized by TERI. I mean, we really appreciate the good work doing by TERI, and we have actually an old connection with TERI. I mean, we remember that at one point it was chaired by Dr. Pachori, who had studied at La Martinière, and a very good French connection, and we know that this connection is still very much alive today, so thank you for all of this. Let me just stress a few achievements of the Indo-French partnership, because we have had quite a few success, and we're very happy about it in the last few weeks. Well, as you know, we had a One Ocean Summit in the city of Brest, taking place on the 11th of February. And Prime Minister Modi blessed us with a message and some talks, and he confirmed India's support to the High Ambition Coalition on Biodiversity beyond national border. Basically, it means that the India, like-minded partners, are going to try to conclude as soon as possible, so in 2022, the so-called Pbnj treaty on ocean protection. It's very important that we do it this year. We've been discussing the need to better steward these marine areas beyond national jurisdiction for almost 10 years now. So it's high time. And as you know, all of you, because you're pretty much specialists, these areas represent grossly 95% of the ocean, and they provide great ecological, economical, social, cultural, scientific, and food security benefits to humanity. So it's really a priority to preserve them, and for that we need to secure a very strong legal framework which is based on science and which would set additional legal obligations. So really, thank you, India. It's really a game changer that India joined this initiative. Second achievement I would like to stress, it's a fight against marine litter, plastic pollution, and it's really, as you know, a key issue to protect our coastal areas and oceans. I mean, again, during this One Ocean Summit, the President of the French Republic, the Indian Prime Minister, they decided to join force and agreed to work together on a global initiative on, or against, we should say, single-use plastics. That's very significant. I think that will have quite a powerful, give a powerful momentum. And I say on the global stage, at multilateral level, we are working also on this issue. My country supports in the UN Environment Assembly the resolution that is proposed by Peru and Rwanda on the launch of negotiations on a global agreement on plastics. We feel that we really need this agreement. I mean, even with all the efforts that are being undertaken today, the world would only see a very limited reduction on plastic discharge into our ocean, only, according to our estimate, only 7% annually within 2040. This is not enough. We can't go like this. So this new global agreement is really the only truly effective response, and we hope that India also will join on this. Let me now conclude by saying that on a broader scope, India also give us a great occasion to rejoice by joining the high ambition on a coalition for nature and people. This is a coalition, a grouping that was launched during the One Planet Summit. It took place in Paris in January 2021 to promote an international agreement to protect at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030. And again, we believe that having India on board is really a game changer. It will be really a real catalyst to spur global action and lead other countries toward a more ambitious agreement. And we're India, but I'm not, you won't learn anything from me on that. Is a real is one of the few 17 mega diverse countries. I mean, and it's really a great place for biodiversity, with at least 4 hotspots, and I'm really impatient to visit all of them. I know a few of them, but not all of them. And this is really an area where our two countries are working extensively with each other. It means on protection issues. We have regular exchanges, cooperation project. Our development agency called AFD has numerous projects, reforestation and biodiversity management. We have a great program in Assam, in the park of Kaziranga, and it has yielded some very significant projects, for example, in the increase of the rhino population. So just to conclude, we very much value our cooperation with India. We think that many progress have been achieved, and we should continue, increase, speed up to protect global common goods, especially biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for highlighting the importance of bilateral cooperation as well as international agreements for protecting our global commons. Without further commenting, I would like to invite Mr. Rafael Goulet, who is the head of Unit of Ocean Governance, Law of the Sea and Arctic Policy of the European Commission. Over to you, Mr. Goulet. Thank you.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. I will certainly not contradict the previous speakers. Our assessment is that the world urgently needs a new economic model, one that decouples economic growth from resource depletion, one that promotes innovative solutions which are carbon neutral and less harmful to the environment. The post-COVID-19 recovery gives us the opportunity to develop such a model. So let's bundle all our efforts and resources to make it happen. In Europe, we call this effort the Green Deal. It starts from the belief that the best way to achieve long-term growth in the EU is by decarbonizing our economy, by moving from linear to circular production and consumption models, and by protecting nature and by cutting waste and pollution. The oceans and marine ecosystems are part of the solution to contribute to the transformation we want. We all know what the current situation of our ocean is. It is suffering from pollution and overexploitation. Marine biodiversity is at risk, and climate change exacerbates this phenomenon. Science tells us that one of the most effective ways to address the emergencies is by respecting and promoting nature-based solutions. For example, marine protected areas. So we need to pursue the limited progress achieved so far. The protected areas already designated cannot remain abstractions. We need to give them management plans to implement and to monitor them. Together, we also need to encourage a perception shift. Beyond protection, well-managed marine protected areas also generate economic benefits. In parallel to strengthening the management of existing marine protected areas, we need to expand the network, in particular to cover the sensitive areas of the high seas. Within the EU, we want to expand the network of marine protected areas to 30% of our seas and protect a wide range of marine habitats and species. Marine protected areas can also be instrumental for building cooperation and transformative change at global level. We do have some success stories. The establishment of the world's largest high seas marine protected area in the Ross Sea in the Southern Ocean comes to mind. It was a milestone in the conservation of Antarctica's unique marine biodiversity and economic systems, but we are still far from the representative system of marine protected areas that the members of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources agreed to establish in 2009. The designation of new marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean is a priority for the EU. Large-scale marine protected areas can help conserve marine biodiversity and build ocean resilience against climate change impacts. To deliver on these commitments, the European Union and its member states have proposed to CAMLA, where India is also a member, the designation of 2 marine protected areas, one in East Antarctica and another in the Weddell Sea. There is widespread support for these proposals within CAMLA, including India as co-sponsor, which we are very grateful for, but there is still a few members which continue to block progress on this important issue. So we will therefore continue our outreach efforts to convince more members to join this cause. There is no time to lose. Biodiversity loss and the climate emergency are going faster than we had anticipated, and it is critical to act now to conserve Antarctica's marine biodiversity and ecosystems. The EU also wants to work with the international community to establish marine protected areas elsewhere in the high seas, including with India, as stated in our joint roadmap 2025. We are particularly happy that India, as highlighted by the ambassador, that India joined the High Ambition Coalition on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, launched by the European Union at the One Ocean Summit organized by France in Brest last week. These ongoing negotiations in the United Nations on Pbnj are a great opportunity to protect the ocean. The new treaty will provide the mechanisms to create globally recognized marine protected areas in the high seas. It will also be instrumental to achieve the ambitious targets we would like to see reflected in the future post-2020 global biodiversity framework, in particular to ensure that at least 30% of the global ocean is conserved. If we succeed, it will be a most significant achievement in ocean governance. We should therefore all join forces to reach an ambitious agreement as soon as possible in 2022. Meanwhile, work in regional fisheries management organizations and regional seas conventions needs to continue unabated to put in place measures for the protection of sensitive ecosystems and species in areas beyond national jurisdiction. In conclusion, better protection of marine ecosystems can bring substantial health, social and economic benefits to coastal communities and the world as a whole. The need for action is clear. Let's join our efforts to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Goulet, for highlighting the various international efforts that EU is spearheading, including regarding the marine protected areas in the high seas. We wish you all the best with all your endeavors, sir, and we will be closely following your efforts. I would now like to request Keystone to please project the screen as we go on to launch Vasundhara, the 9th edition of which is a student magazine of the TERI School of Advanced Studies. So this is the 9th edition of Vasundhara. This is Vasundhara in Vasundhara means Earth and planet Earth. And as you can see, the very beautiful pictures on the screen. And the theme of the 9th edition of the magazine was wetlands. Next slide, please. So I would like to acknowledge this is a entirely student-led magazine which started post-COVID, and we commend the efforts of all the students of TERI School of Advanced Studies, the editorial team, the content team, the design team, as well as the artists. So now we just move on to the next slide and the launch of the magazine. Here. So congratulations to all the students of TERI School of Advanced Study for taking this very, very important issue. And we recently had the World Wetland Day. And thank you so much for bringing these issues out so clearly, in such a aesthetic manner. And congratulations to all of you. So thanks a lot. With this, I'd hand over the mic back to Shan. And Shan, can you please conclude and close the session, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Shelly. On behalf of TERI and WSDS Secretariat, we thank all the distinguished speakers for an insightful discussion. Thank you all. Stay tuned. The agenda is available on our platform. The next plenary is scheduled in 15 minutes. Thank you all.